All right, so get this. Japan is about to, totally revamp its labor laws.
Yeah, in 2025.
A ton of them.
Yeah.
And, you sent in a bunch of stuff to make sure you're ready for this.
It's a lot to keep track of, for sure.
We've got government documents, guides, even some articles all in Japanese, too, to help us figure out how things like childcare, elder care, and flexible work are all going to change.
Definitely a sign that Japan's trying to modernize its work culture.
Exactly. So think of this like your cheat sheet to Japan's work revolution. We're breaking down the biggest changes, why they're happening, and what it all means for you. And, some of this is really surprising.
Like what?
Well, did you know that parental leave in Japan could soon be almost like getting paid to take time off?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The goal is to encourage more parents, especially fathers, to actually take time off after they have a kid.
Okay, so let's start with this childcare revolution. Japan is really upping its game when it comes to helping working parents, especially those with younger kids.
One of the biggest changes is how they're expanding childcare leave. It used to only cover kids up to preschool age, but now it includes kids all the way to the end of 3rd grade.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Imagine how much more flexibility that gives parents. I'm curious, though, what kind of impact do you think this will have on companies? Will they even be able to handle these longer leave periods?
Well, it's going to require some adjustments, for sure. We might see more companies, adopting things like telework to make it easier for parents to manage work and family.
That makes sense.
In fact, the government is actually pushing for telework to be an option, even when a company's usual short-time work system doesn't allow for it.
So it seems like these changes are really pushing companies towards a more flexible future, whether they're ready or not.
Yeah, and it's not just telework either. Companies will have to offer at least 2 different flexible work options to parents with kids between 3 and 6, starting at the end of 2025.
Hold on, this is a pretty big deal then. We're talking about a potential shift in Japanese work culture, right?
Absolutely. These changes are all about creating a better work environment for parents and hopefully a better work-life balance for everyone.
Let's get into the details of that parental leave pay increase. You mentioned it earlier. Is it really possible for parents to get almost their full salary while on leave?
Yes. Under this new system called the Birth Leave Support Payment, eligible couples could get pretty close to their full salary while they're on leave. It's a huge increase from what they have now.
So Japan is putting their money where their mouth is. What's the thinking behind this? Is it just about making things easier for parents, or is there something more to it?
It is about supporting parents, for sure. But it's also a clear policy goal to encourage more fathers to take parental leave. Childcare has traditionally fallen more on mothers in Japan. This new system is trying to create a more equal division of labor within families.
That's a really interesting point. Do you think this could lead to some actual lasting changes in gender roles and expectations in Japan?
It's possible. By making it financially viable for fathers to take leave, the government's sending a strong message about how important involved fatherhood is. This could have long-term effects on how families in Japan handle childcare and work responsibilities.
And it's not just about childcare, right? Elder care is a growing concern in Japan, too, and it looks like these 2025 changes are addressing that as well.
That's right. Companies will now be required to have individual consultations with employees about their caregiving leave options. It's a big step towards making sure workers know their rights and what support they have available.
And I heard there's a proactive element to this, too. It's not just waiting for employees to come ask for help.
Exactly. They're now obligated to tell employees about caregiving leave options when they turn 40. It gives people time to plan and make arrangements for potential caregiving needs down the road.
So Japan is acknowledging that caregiving isn't something that just pops up out of nowhere. It's about giving people the information and support they need to balance their work in caregiving.
And this is especially important in a country like Japan with an aging population. The need for elder care support is only going to increase.
Okay, before we move on, I want to talk about something that might seem like a small detail, but could actually have a huge impact. Going digital Japan is getting rid of paper for a lot of its labor-related processes.
Right. Starting in January 2025, companies will need to switch to electronic filing for things like safety reports, health checkups, and other documents.
What kind of challenges do you think we'll see with this transition? Is Japan's workforce ready for such a big digital leap?
It's definitely going to require some adjustments. Companies will need to invest in new systems, train their employees, and make sure their data security is up to par. There might be a learning curve, especially for older workers who might not be as familiar with digital processes.
It sounds like this seemingly small change could actually lead to a much bigger transformation in how Japanese companies operate.
I think so. It's a move towards modernization and efficiency, but it'll need careful planning and execution to make sure the transition goes smoothly.
All right, we've covered a lot already. Expanded childcare leave, flexible work options that parental leave pay, increased elder care support, and the switch to electronic filing. It's clear that Japan is taking some big steps to update its work culture.
And we're just getting started. Next, we'll really dig into how these changes could play out in real life, exploring both the potential benefits and the challenges that might come up.
Stay tuned, because in Part 2, we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty details of how these changes could impact both employers and employees in Japan. Welcome back. We're diving even deeper into these changes coming to Japanese labor laws. We've got the big picture now, but let's get into the specifics.
Right, because, it sounds good on paper, but how's it going to work in real life?
Exactly. So let's start with that expanded childcare leave. Covering kids up to third grade is a huge change. One article you sent mentioned how this could impact employers, and it got me thinking, are companies even ready for this?
Oh, it's definitely going to be a big adjustment. Instead of one long leave, employers might start getting more frequent shorter requests. A parent might need a couple days here and there for school events or if school's closed unexpectedly.
So less about planning for a year off and more about building flexibility into how things run day to day.
Exactly. And for companies that haven't really embraced things like telework, this could be what pushes them to finally get on board.
Makes sense. Because suddenly offering flexible work arrangements isn't just a nice thing to do, it's a necessity.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before that the government is really pushing for telework, even in jobs that haven't typically been done remotely.
Yeah, one of the sources actually quoted a labor ministry official saying that companies need to figure out how to make telework work, even if it means rethinking how jobs are structured and what people are responsible for.
So are we talking about a potential restructuring of how work gets done in Japan?
It's definitely possible. This push for flexibility could make companies become more efficient, more focused on results.
I see what you mean. If you have to figure out how to function with fewer people on site, you might have to look at things differently, streamline processes, and really focus on getting things done.
Exactly. And this could actually be good for everyone, not just parents. A more flexible and efficient work culture could mean a better work-life balance for everyone.
Now let's talk about that pay increase for parental leave. It sounds almost too good to be true, getting almost your full salary while on leave. But I gotta ask, are there any potential downsides here?
Well, one concern is the financial burden on smaller businesses. They might have trouble covering salaries for employees who are on leave for a long time.
So while it's great for parents, it could unintentionally make things harder for small businesses compared to big corporations.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it shows that the government needs to help smaller businesses adapt to these changes.
Speaking of support, let's move to elder care. We talked about those mandatory consultations to tell employees about their options. It sounds good, but are there any potential unintended consequences?
Well, one thing to think about is how companies will react to these consultations. Some, especially those with more traditional views, might see it as a hassle.
So it's not enough to just create the policies you have, to create a real culture shift where companies actually support elder care.
Absolutely. It's a change in mindset, recognizing that caregiving affects the workplace, and it needs to be addressed proactively.
And to bring it back to think about how these changes could affect your own workplace. Would your company be open to these new expectations?
That's a good question. It really shows how these changes will probably play out differently depending on the industry and the company culture.
All right, let's get back to electronic filing. It seems simple enough, but I'm sure there are challenges we haven't considered yet.
For sure, cybersecurity, for one, becomes even more important when you're dealing with sensitive employee data online.
So companies need to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
Secure systems, employee training, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of digital literacy in the workforce. Not everyone is equally comfortable with technology, especially older employees.
Which means companies need to offer training and support to make sure everyone can make the transition smoothly.
Right. And it's not just about teaching people how to use the new systems. It's about addressing any concerns or anxieties they might have about this digital shift.
Okay, last topic for this section. The end of mandatory retirement at 60. We touched on this before, but I'm curious about how it could impact younger workers.
Some people think that keeping older workers around longer could limit opportunities for younger generations to move up.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? You want to benefit from the experience of older workers while also making sure younger talent has room to grow.
Right. That's why things like mentoring programs, knowledge transfer initiatives, and succession planning become so important.
It seems like all of these changes are connected, and they could really change the Japanese workplace in a big way.
Absolutely. And it's not just about employers adapting, it's also about employees understanding these changes and speaking up for what they need. It's a two-way street.
All right, everyone, that's it for part 2. We've looked at the real-world effects of these labor law changes, and I don't know about you, but I'm even more interested now.
And in our last segment, we're going to zoom out even further and look at the even bigger picture. We'll think about the broader impact of these changes on society and explore some thought-provoking questions about the future of work in Japan. Stick with us.
And we're back for our final look at Japan's 2025 labor law changes. We've talked about so much, from expanding childcare leave to getting rid of mandatory retirement.
And now we get to take a step back and consider the bigger picture.
Sure.
How will these changes affect Japanese society overall?
Right, because it's not just about tweaking some policies. It's about potentially changing how people think about work, family, and how to balance those two.
One area where these changes could have a big impact is gender roles. Remember that parental leave pay increase we talked about?
Yeah.
Could that lead to a more equal split of childcare responsibilities in Japanese families?
It's an interesting question, for sure. Traditionally, mothers have done most of the caregiving in Japan. But if more fathers are encouraged to take leave, could we see a shift towards more equal parenting?
It's definitely possible. And if more fathers are actively involved in childcare right from the beginning, it could change how women's careers progress too.
I see what you mean. Fewer women might feel like they have to choose between their career and taking care of their kids. That could mean more women participating in the workforce.
Exactly. And that could be good for the economy too. More women in leadership positions, more diverse perspectives. It's a potential win-win.
But let's look at the other side of the coin for a minute. Could there be any negative consequences that we didn't intend? We talked about the challenges for businesses, but what about potential downsides for individuals?
Well, one worry is that focusing more on childcare and elder care support could unintentionally make things harder for employees who don't have those responsibilities.
So you could end up with people who don't have caregiving duties feeling resentful or like they're not being treated fairly?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It shows why it's important for companies to communicate clearly and be sensitive to everyone's situation to make sure everyone feels valued and supported.
It seems like one of the big takeaways from all these changes is the need for more flexibility and understanding in the workplace.
I agree. These policies are all about recognizing that everyone has different needs and responsibilities outside of work and finding ways to work with those differences.
Speaking of flexibility, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the long-term impact of these 2025 changes. How could they shape the future of work in Japan?
Well, one possibility is a much more fluid work landscape, where the lines between work life and personal life become less clear.
So we could see more remote work, more gig work, more project-based jobs.
Yeah.
Basically more options and more freedom for workers.
Exactly. And that could put more emphasis on skills and results instead of how much time someone spends in the office. Performance reviews might start to focus on what employees actually accomplish, not just how many hours they work.
That would be a pretty big change in how people think. It would require a different kind of management style, one that's focused on trust and results instead of constantly checking up on people.
Absolutely. And it's a change that many companies around the world are trying to figure out as technology changes and the way people work changes.
Speaking of technology, I have to ask, what role do you think it will play in this evolving Japanese workplace?
Well, on the one hand, things like AI and automation could actually help companies deal with some of the challenges of these new arrangements, like scheduling, assigning tasks, and tracking performance.
So technology could actually make it easier to implement and manage these changes.
Right, but on the other hand, those same technologies could also eliminate some jobs, especially jobs that can be easily automated.
Which means it becomes even more important for workers to keep learning new things and adapting their skills so they can stay competitive in this changing job market.
It's a constant process of learning, like you said, and it means people need to be proactive and take charge of their own career development.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening look at these changes. We've explored the main points, the potential benefits, the possible downsides, and even looked ahead to what the future of work in Japan might look like.
And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn from the sources you sent us. We encourage you to keep digging into the topics that interest you.
Think about the questions we've raised today, the potential impacts we've talked about, and how these changes could affect your own work and your own life.
Because in the end, the success of these changes depends on individuals, companies, and all of society adapting and embracing this new way of working.
It's a really interesting time to be watching all of this unfold, and we'll be here with you as we continue to explore the always changing world of work.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.